the summer of 1776, 13 fragile colonies scattered along the Atlantic coast made a choice that stunned the world. They challenged the most powerful empire on earth, not with cannons, but with paper, ink, and an idea that all men are created equal. But this decision did not come in a burst of fireworks or the clash of swords. It came slowly, like fog lifting at dawn. It was not the work of warriors at first, but of farmers, merchants, printers, and dreamers who gathered in quiet rooms lit by flickering candlelight. In those rooms, over the scent of ink and wax, they talked of liberty, not always boldly, not always clearly, but enough to move something inside each other. They wrote letters, they debated, they disagreed, and sometimes they just sat in silence, wondering what kind of world they were about to step into. This is not the loud story of a revolution. This is the soft version, the one told in letters never sent, in journals left behind, in footsteps on wooden floors. This is the story of a people who had no real army, no navy, no great riches, but who had a question. What if we didn't belong to a king anymore? So if you'd like, get comfortable. Let the names of streets in Boston and farms in Virginia gently pass you by. Let the sound of old pens scratching across parchment echo softly in your mind. And as we travel back to those years, remember, the story of independence was never just about war. It was about waiting, doubting, choosing, and above all, hoping. A quiet world that didn't know it was changing. Before there were cannonballs and cries for freedom, before flags were stitched or declarations drafted, before the idea of a United States was even whispered aloud, there was a slow life unfolding along the edge of a continent. 13 colonies, not a union, not yet, just fragments of a distant empire, each with its own rhythm, its own customs, its own quiet dreams. In the north, New England wore its rocky soil like a badge of patience. Here, farmers rose early, hands rough with the work of living simply. They prayed in wooden churches with drafty windows, debated with passion in taverns, and taught their children to read the Bible and fear God more than the taxman. Further south, the cities of Philadelphia and New York bustled, but not loudly. Carriages moved slowly over cobblestone. Printers set type in ink-stained aprons. Merchants tallied their ledgers by candlelight. There were no skyscrapers, only steeples, chimneys, and rooftops lined with laundry. In Virginia, life moved with the rhythm of tobacco. Plantations sprawled like kingdoms, overseen by men who spoke gently but owned lives in silence. Their wealth was tied to the land, and to the backs of those who worked it without ever tasting its rewards. Even further south, in Georgia and the Carolinas, the air was thick with heat and Spanish moss, and the lines between wealth and poverty ran sharper than the blades used to harvest sugar and cotton. The soil was rich, the freedom was not. And yet, amid all this quiet, a storm was gathering, not in the skies, but in the minds of men and women who were beginning, just barely, to wonder. They wondered, why does a king an ocean away decide how much tea should cost? Why do we send silver to London and receive silence in return? Why do we bow our heads to men we've never seen? These were not shouts. They were whispers passed over porches and through parlor doors, between sips of cider, between sermons, between the lines of letters that began to read a little differently than before. There were those who still called themselves loyal. They sang "God Save the King" with genuine feeling. They saw rebellion not as courage, but as chaos. To them, order mattered more than liberty. There were others, too, who hadn't yet chosen a side, not because they were indifferent, but because they were tired. Tired from working the land, tired from paying taxes, tired from simply trying to survive another winter. And then there were the few, always the few, who could already hear the sound of something larger. They were the ones who read Thomas Paine's words and felt a pulse in their chest. The ones who wrote letters to cousins in other colonies asking, "Do you feel it too?" The land itself was quiet. The rivers still flowed. The trees still turned golden in the fall. The fires still burned in hearths across Massachusetts, Delaware, and beyond. No one had fired a musket yet. No ships had been sunk. No one had said the word independence without fear. But change had begun like a distant drum, slow and steady, not yet a call to arms, more like a heartbeat that connected a boy delivering newspapers in Boston to a widowed mother tending her small field in Maryland, to a blacksmith in New Jersey, to a Quaker schoolteacher in Pennsylvania. They did not know each other, but they would, and together, in ways none of them could imagine, they would build something new. They were not rebels yet. They were still subjects, still waiting, still hoping, still waking each day, not knowing they were living in the pause before history speaks. Before armies marched and alliances formed, before uniforms were stitched and flags were raised, there were only words. They came quietly, at first scratched in ink, tucked into newspapers, whispered in taverns and parlors. They weren't battle cries. Not yet. They were questions, challenges, hopes wrapped in sentences. And among the voices rising in that chorus, one rang louder and clearer than the rest. It was the voice of a man few had known just months before a man who arrived in America, poor, sick, and nearly invisible. His name was Thomas Paine. He wasn't born among the founding fathers. He didn't sit in halls of power or wear the polished shoes of high society. He came from England with a printer's mind and a restless spirit. He had failed at corset making, struggled in marriage, and barely survived on the edge of poverty. But in America, he found something better than money, a moment, and he had the words to meet it. In January 1776, as winter blanketed the colonies, Paine published a slim pamphlet, just 48 pages. It was called Common Sense. No trumpets announced its arrival. No leaders endorsed it. Yet it spread like fire and dry brush. It was printed, reprinted, passed from hand to hand, read aloud in taverns, copied into letters, quoted at dinner tables. For many colonists, it was the first time they truly heard someone say aloud what had only been thought in private. That monarchy was a farce. That the colonies didn't need reconciliation, they needed independence. That the time to act wasn't later, it was now. Even George Washington had common sense read aloud to his troops. Soldiers who could barely spell now listened to arguments for democracy, for dignity, for revolution. A new nation was not born with a flag or a gun. It was born with an idea. And Thomas Paine had written its lullaby and its anthem. By the summer of 1776, Philadelphia was not just a city, it was a crossroad of consequence. Perched quietly along the Delaware River, its cobbled lanes and red brick buildings wore the heat like a wool coat. The air was thick with the scent of horse sweat, ink, and tobacco. Children played between rows of market stalls. Bells rang faintly from churches with spires that stretched earnestly toward the sky. But behind shuttered windows and inside quiet rooms, something weightier than the humidity hung over the city. It was decision. For months, Philadelphia had become the silent capital of a noisy continent. Delegates from 13 colonies had gathered in a stuffy hall to decide a future they could barely name. The Second Continental Congress was a gathering not of soldiers or kings, but of merchants, lawyers, farmers, printers, ordinary men now asked to shape the extraordinary. Each morning they arrived in powdered wigs and creaking boots, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Some bore letters from home, others the weight of regions still uncertain whether to rebel or retreat. And though the city bustled outside, inside the Pennsylvania State House, the mood was heavy, measured not in hours, but in heartbeats. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. Thick wooden doors muffled raised voices. The air grew stale, with every closed window kept shut not by fear of rain but of eavesdropping. Outside, curious citizens lingered on street corners, speculating about what the Congress would do next. Inside, the delegates argued. Some feared the loss of trade, others feared the gallows. Still, others feared what might come if they didn't act. But all of them, whether from Georgia or Massachusetts, knew that something irreversible was taking shape. At the center of it all stood a Virginia planter with quiet eyes and quiet strength, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was not the loudest voice in the hall, nor the most experienced, but he had a talent for turning ideas into language and language into legacy. And when the task came to write a declaration, his was the pen they chose. In a modest room lit by filtered sunlight, Jefferson sat at a slanted desk, writing by hand. He scratched and crossed out, paused, pondered. The words did not arrive in a thunderclap. They came gently, like dust in a beam of light. We hold these truths to be self-evident. He was writing not just for the Congress, not just for the colonies, but for the future, for posterity, for people he would never meet, for ears that had not yet been born. And outside that room, Philadelphia waited. Carpenters hammered beams. Vendors sold apples and candles. Children skipped stones on the river. But under it all, pulsed a city aware deeply, aware that something was shifting. Whispers spread from tavern to tavern, from print shop to parlor. Will they do it? People asked. Will they actually declare independence? Some feared British retaliation. Others welcomed it. Most, however, simply wanted to know which side of history they would wake up on. And slowly, the Congress moved. Debates grew louder. Letters from constituents grew sharper. The mood changed from hesitation to inevitability. Not because the danger had lessened, it hadn't, but because silence was no longer safety. To delay was to betray. To speak was to become. And so they spoke. One by one, colonies moved toward consensus. Votes were cast, pens signed. Jefferson's words, once only ink, became declaration. On the 2nd of July, they voted for independence. On the 4th of July, they approved the final wording of the document. And in the streets of Philadelphia, bells tolled not to celebrate, but to signal the solemnity of what had just occurred. A nation had not yet been born, but the decision to conceive it had been made. That night, the city did not erupt in fireworks. It exhaled. In candlelit homes, families sat around tables and read the first printed copies of the Declaration. In boarding houses, travelers whispered the news to strangers. Across the river, in the quiet fields of New Jersey, men looked east and wondered what the dawn would bring. Philadelphia had waited, and in waiting, it had witnessed the moment when uncertainty became history. A document had been written, a path had been chosen, the silence had been broken. In the heat of a Philadelphia summer, while horses clopped along Market Street and apricot trees dropped fruit onto dusty paths, a man sat alone at a desk in a rented room, pen in hand, heart somewhere between fear and history. His name was Thomas Jefferson, and he was writing a breakup letter to a king. It wasn't a task he asked for. It was one the Second Continental Congress quietly placed upon his shoulders. They needed someone to write a declaration, a statement of purpose, a justification for rebellion, a vision for a future that did not yet exist. Others in the Congress had experience, voices that carried louder, but Jefferson had something different: the stillness of thought, the precision of words, and a kind of poetic stubbornness that made him believe liberty could fit on a piece of parchment. So they left him alone, in a modest house owned by a bricklayer, with a slanted writing desk, a few books, and the scent of old paper curling at the edges. He dipped his quill in ink. He began. The words didn't come all at once. They came in waves, measured, tentative, bold. When in the course of human events, he paused. Outside, the city stirred. Blacksmiths hammered steel. A preacher recited prayers through an open window, and children chased chickens through alleyways. Life moved on, unaware that inside this room, a nation was being born line by line. It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands. It was elegant, but it was also defiant. This was not a manifesto of anger. It was a declaration of necessity. Jefferson, always quiet in person, spoke loudest with ink, and what he was saying between the flourishes and formalities was simple. We no longer belong to you. The most famous sentence he wrote, the one school children recite centuries later, was not shouted in a square or thundered in a courtroom. It was whispered into existence by candlelight. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Jefferson believed in ideals, even if the world he lived in did not. He wrote those words while knowing full well that he, like many others, owned enslaved people. The contradiction was not hidden from him. But still, he wrote the sentence, not because he had lived up to it, but because he believed the future could. Days passed. The heat lingered. He revised. He scratched out lines. He added grievances, more than 24 complaints against King George III. He has obstructed justice. He has imposed taxes. He has kept standing armies among us. It was a list of betrayal. A list meant not just to justify independence, but to explain it to the world, to France, to Spain, to God, to every soul who might one day ask, why? And still, Jefferson wrote not in the voice of revenge, but of reason. He knew this was not just a declaration. It was a mirror for a young country to look into for centuries to come. When the draft was finished, it passed from hand to hand, first to John Adams, who nodded with grim approval, then to Benjamin Franklin, who famously suggested softening Jefferson's more cutting phrases with wry edits. Together, they shaped the word-sanding rough edges, debating punctuation, trimming emotion without cutting truth. Finally, it was presented to the Congress. The room fell silent. No one spoke for a long time. Then they read. Slowly, carefully, line by line. They debated. They revised again. They crossed out Jefferson's condemnation of slavery, afraid it would divide the southern colonies. Jefferson seethed quietly but said little. He knew compromise was the price of unity. On the 4th of July, 1776, the final draft was approved. It wasn't signed that day. There were no fireworks, no bands, only a tired but resolute gathering of men who understood the weight of what they had done. They had declared independence not with swords, but with sentences. And sentences, they knew, could change the world. The Declaration of Independence was printed that night by a quiet man named John Dunlap, who worked through the early hours in a small shop lit by oil lamps. He printed 25 copies, known now as the Dunlap broadsides. They were delivered on horseback across the colonies, read aloud in town squares, nailed to church doors. In those words, people heard the birth of something new, not just a country, but a commitment to an idea, flawed in execution, but eternal in aspiration. King George III read the document weeks later. He dismissed it at first. A tantrum, he called it, a rebellion by ungrateful children. But deep down, he felt the shift. The colonies were no longer asking, they were telling. And Jefferson? He went home, tired, uncertain, hopeful. His draft would be edited, his ideals questioned, his contradictions exposed. But that one sentence, all men are created equal, would outlive them all. To be continued in Part 6. Voices in the Hall, the days of signing. Bạn muốn mình viết tiếp phần 6 tại đây luôn chứ? Chỉ cần nói, continue to Part 6, mình sẽ tiếp tục ngay, viết đầy đủ và mượt mà. Where courage was measured in ink, not armor. The ink was dry, but the silence still lingered. After days of debate, after edits and arguments, after crossing out some dreams and keeping others intact, the words of the Declaration had finally been agreed upon. But agreeing to the words was not enough. Now came the part that mattered most, signing them. And signing in 1776 wasn't symbolic. It wasn't ceremonial. It was dangerous. To sign your name on that document was to commit treason against the British Crown. It meant that, if the war was lost, the gallows would wait. It meant no hiding, no excuses, no going back. John Hancock knew this when he stepped forward. He took the quill in his hand, dipped it into the inkwell, and pressed it to the parchment. With deliberate strokes, he wrote his name large, unmistakable, unmissable. So the king can read it without his spectacles, he reportedly said. It was not bravado, it was clarity, a statement that this rebellion had no shadows left to hide in. The hall was quiet that day. Hot air pressed against the thick wooden walls. Dust danced in shafts of sunlight. Outside, the sounds of horses, bells, and children still echoed faintly. But inside, everything slowed. One by one, the delegates came forward. Samuel Adams, with a gaze like dry fire, signed with steady hands. Benjamin Franklin, older than most, smiled faintly as he wrote, though he warned, half joking, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." Thomas Jefferson added his name, not far below the words he had written. His signature was quiet, but behind it lay the power of 1,000 sleepless nights. John Adams, always stern, signed with the posture of a man who had argued for this moment since before others dared to whisper it. Some hands trembled, others didn't. Some men signed with defiance, some with duty. A few if they were honest with themselves, with fear. But all of them signed with something rare in human history: conviction. These were not professional revolutionaries. They were shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, printers. Many had families, children, estates, livelihoods. They had everything to lose, but still, they chose to write their names. In all, 56 delegates would sign the Declaration, from 13 very different colonies. They disagreed on nearly everything: religion, commerce, slavery, regional pride, political structure. But they agreed on one thing: that liberty was worth the risk. Each name, carefully written, became a thread in the nation's tapestry, and each signature turned the Declaration from a piece of writing into an act of rebellion. The parchment was not framed, not yet. It was rolled, carried, protected, sometimes hidden under floorboards, sometimes locked in iron boxes. For years, it would travel with the Congress itself, fleeing from British troops, crossing rivers, dodging raids. But wherever it went, the words remained, and so did the names. Some of those names you may know: John Hancock, the first and boldest; Thomas Jefferson, the pen; John Adams, the fire; Benjamin Franklin, the wisdom. Others are less famous, but no less brave. Button Gwinnett of Georgia, who died in a duel the year after he signed; Thomas Nelson Jr., who used his own home as a target during a siege because British officers had taken it over; Francis Lewis, whose wife was imprisoned and whose home was destroyed; and Richard Stockton, captured by the British, held in harsh conditions, and released only when he renounced the revolution, something he later regretted for the rest of his life. Signing was not a gesture, it was a sentence. In the days that followed, word spread. In taverns and churches, the Declaration was read aloud. Crowds gathered, some in awe, some in fear. In New York, a statue of King George III was pulled down and melted into musket balls. But it wasn't celebration for all. Some colonists, still loyal to the crown, were appalled. Some feared retaliation. Some simply didn't believe the colonies could stand alone. But for the signers, the decision had already been made. Their names were now part of the story. Their fate, tied together, win or lose. The world watched, cautiously. France observed, intrigued. Spain waited, skeptical. Britain, prepared. The king read the Declaration not with sorrow, but with scorn. To him, these were deluded traitors. Rebellion would be crushed. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. As summer deepened, the parchment remained in Philadelphia, guarded, revered, quietly passed from hand to hand. And somewhere, in the stillness of the night, as candles flickered and fireflies danced beyond the window panes, some of those men with ink on their fingers and fear in their hearts lay awake, wondering not if they had done the right thing, but whether they had done enough. To be continued in Part 7. The king responds. A distant throne trembles, where silence turned to fury, and fury turned to war. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in a palace of polished marble and hushed servants, a king stood by a window and read the words that had arrived in an envelope sealed with rebel ink. He did not slam the parchment down. He did not tear it in half. Instead, King George III read the Declaration of Independence with a kind of cold stillness. His jaw clenched. His mind turned. He had known unrest was growing in the colonies. There had been letters, reports, rumors. The tea had been dumped. His soldiers had been mocked. But this was open defiance. This was war. And now, the colonies were not just refusing orders. They were renouncing him, God's appointed ruler, sovereign of an empire upon which the sun never set. To be told by farmers, silversmiths, and tobacco planters that they would no longer bend the knee, it was not just rebellion, it was insult. Inside St. James's Palace, courtiers whispered. Some were angry, some amused, some cautious, but none truly believed the colonies would succeed. How will they feed an army? One asked. Who will recognize them? Another scoffed. They have no king, no navy, no coin, no allies. But George III knew better than to laugh. He had ruled for nearly 2 decades. He had quelled riots, managed wars, and watched the tides of revolution rise in Europe. He had seen what a single idea could do when it caught fire. He called his ministers. He summoned Parliament. He prepared his generals. And in the quiet of his study, he made a vow: we shall restore order whatever the cost. Across Britain, responses varied. Some cheered for swift revenge. Others sighed with weary dread. Some, especially those who had once lived in the colonies, felt a pang of sorrow. Was this truly necessary? Was there no way back? But the king was resolute. He declared the colonies in open rebellion. He ordered the Navy to tighten its grip on American ports. He authorized reinforcements, thousands of new troops to sail across the Atlantic. And then, most notably, he hired Hessian mercenaries, professional soldiers from German principalities, trained, disciplined, and deadly. To the colonists, this was proof. The king would rather pay foreign troops to fight his own subjects than listen to their pleas. If there had been any doubt about reconciliation, it ended there. In Parliament, voices rose. Some, like Edmund Burke, pleaded for caution. He had long warned that the colonies were not just territories, they were people. People with pride, with purpose. But others, like Lord North, the king's loyal prime minister, saw only defiance. And defiance demanded punishment. War was no longer coming. It had arrived. Ships set sail from Portsmouth and Liverpool. Rows upon rows of red-coated soldiers stood on deck, young, grim-faced, silent. Some had fought before in Europe. Others were seeing the ocean for the first time. Their commanders carried maps. Their bags carried orders. To subdue, to occupy, to crush. The king's message was clear. If they will not be loyal, they will be taught to regret it. Back in America, the news traveled slowly, but its weight was immediate. The colonies now knew what they had invited. It would not be a symbolic struggle. It would be war, real and brutal. Church bells rang in warning. Town councils met in urgency. The militia trained harder. Letters were written to loved ones, to mothers, to distant cousins across the colonies. The revolution, once a matter of debate, was now a matter of survival. And yet, even as the king readied his forces, he misunderstood something deep and quiet. The nature of the rebellion. He believed it was about taxes, about trade, about pride. But the revolution was about dignity, about a people deciding they would no longer ask for permission to exist, about a baker in New Hampshire who wanted his son to grow up free, about a farmer in Virginia who wanted to sell his grain without a crown's approval, about a widow in New Jersey who had lost her husband to a British musket in Boston and refused to lose her son the same way. George III saw disobedience. What he missed was the transformation. These were no longer colonies. They were becoming a country. That summer, storms rolled across the Atlantic, literal ones. Ships were delayed. Soldiers became ill. Plans shifted. In New York, General George Washington watched from his camp. He knew the British were coming, knew they were stronger, knew they were better supplied. But he also knew something else. They were not fighting for their home, and in war, that difference would matter. By autumn, British ships blackened the horizon. British boots crushed American soil. British flags flew from steeples and forts. The king's power had arrived, but so had resolve. And as cannon smoke began to rise, as thunder cracked across the battlefield, as the ink of the Declaration turned into the fire of resistance, both sides came to understand there was no turning back. Where bullets followed words and hope faced steel, by the late summer of 1776, the war was no longer a distant fear. It had a face, it had boots on the ground, and it had arrived in New York Harbor not as a whisper, but as a thunder. British ships filled the horizon like a forest of masts, their sails stretched taut in the wind. The sea itself seemed to sag under their weight. Locals counted over 400 vessels, the largest military fleet ever assembled in North America up to that point. To the people of New York, shopkeepers, dock workers, children peering from rooftops, it felt as if the sky itself had lowered. The flags of the empire fluttered high above the decks, proud and unyielding. Inside those ships were 32,000 soldiers, British regulars and Hessian mercenaries. Their red coats gleamed in the sun, their muskets were clean, their commanders were seasoned, and their orders were simple: crush the rebellion, quickly, completely. Meanwhile, on the shores of Manhattan and Brooklyn, General George Washington waited. But waiting was not idleness, it was burden. He had only 19,000 men, many of them farmers, blacksmiths, boys who had never fired a musket in their lives. Their uniforms were mismatched, their boots worn, their weapons varied and scarce. What they lacked in training, they tried to make up for in will. Washington knew what was coming. He had read the reports. He stood on a hill overlooking the harbor and saw the empire sailing toward him. He did not panic. He did not bluster. He prepared in silence, in prayer, in realism. He ordered fortifications to be built, trenches dug, and, perhaps most importantly, he braced his men not just for combat, but for the psychological weight of what they were about to face. Then came the 27th of August, 1776, the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn. It was the first major battle after the Declaration of Independence, and it nearly ended the Revolution before it truly began. The British launched a flanking maneuver, clever, swift, and overwhelming. American lines collapsed. Smoke filled the trees. Confusion spread like fire through the ranks. Some soldiers fought bravely. Others fled in panic. Blood stained the fields of Brooklyn. Bodies lay among the hedgerows, quiet beneath the buzzing of late summer insects. Washington watched from a ridge. He clenched his fists. He did not curse. He observed the way a leader must, even when his heart breaks. He knew retreat was the only option. To stay would mean destruction. So, under the cover of night, he made a decision. Washington ordered a complete withdrawal across the East River, with no bridges, with the British only miles away, with silence as his only ally. He gathered boats, every fishing vessel, every barge, every rowboat. Through the darkness, his men began to cross. Thousands of them, silently. Paddles dipped like ghost wings into black water. Officers whispered instructions. Wounded men leaned on friends. Oars swam alongside ferry. They carried their cannons, their packs, their fear. They left no fire burning behind them. No sound, just footprints in the mud. And as dawn approached too soon, too bright a thick fog rolled in from the river. It was, as many would later say, miraculous. The fog clung to the ground, hiding the last boats as they escaped. When the British advanced that morning, they found nothing but empty earth and a rising mist. Washington's army had vanished. The revolution had survived its first trial. Barely. From that point forward, the war became something else. Not a bold march to victory, but a long, bitter struggle of attrition and endurance. Washington moved his army from New York to New Jersey and beyond. The British followed. Towns changed hands. Supply lines stretched thin. Spies whispered in taverns. And throughout the colonies, the question began to rise. Can we win this? Many thought no. Desertions increased. Some towns refused to feed soldiers. Some patriots buried their uniforms and pledged loyalty to the crown again, quietly. The glow of the 4th of July had faded. Now there was only cold mud, empty bellies, and a king's wrath growing hotter by the day. But Washington did not collapse. He did not demand perfection from his men-only persistence. He wrote letters to Congress asking for supplies. He reorganized regiments. He walked among his soldiers at night. He remembered their names. He understood something few others did, that in this war, survival was itself a form of victory. Each week they held on. The British grew more frustrated. Each village that refused to surrender became a symbol. Each small skirmish, each retreat that wasn't a rout, was a message. We are still here. And in the cold cabins of New Jersey, near makeshift camps lit by dwindling campfires, Washington read aloud again from Thomas Paine, who had just published The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. Those words struck deep. They did not make the soldiers warmer, or fuller, or stronger, but they made them remember why they were there. Not for glory, not for revenge, but for something better than kings. As the first steps into war became a long march, as the British chased shadows through forests and rivers, as hope dimmed and reignited over and over again, the world watched, and the colonies, still fragile, still afraid, stood together. Not perfectly, not always, but enough, where freedom was not just fought on fields, but inside homes and hearts. Not every revolution is fought with muskets. Some are fought at the dinner table, in the silences between family members, in the glances across a neighbor's fence. By 1777, the war for independence was no longer just a military conflict. It had crept into kitchens, bedrooms, barns, and church pews. It divided communities, broke apart friendships, and turned relatives into strangers. Because while the war raged on battlefields, it also raged within the hearts of ordinary people. Not everyone wanted independence. This was a truth that the romantic retellings would later blur, but the truth was unavoidable at the time. A large portion of the American population, perhaps 1/3 or more, remained loyal to the British Crown. They were called loyalists, and their reasons were as varied as their faces. Some were older citizens who had known only British rule their entire lives and feared the chaos of change. Others were merchants who depended on trade with London, or Anglican clergy who had sworn oaths to the king. Some simply believed in order over upheaval. Some just didn't trust the men in Philadelphia to replace the king with anything better. Then there were those on the other side, the patriots. These were the ones who marched with Washington, who read Paine by firelight, who hung flags from porches and whispered of liberty. But even within patriot ranks, unity was not simple. Some believed in full democracy, others in strong, centralized control. Some spoke of freedom while owning slaves. Others fought for liberty while denying it to their wives and daughters. The revolution was not pure. It was not clean. It was human. And in between these two were the people who make up every society. The unsure, the quiet majority, the in-betweeners, farmers who just wanted to keep their crops alive, mothers who feared for their sons no matter what color their uniform, children who played war games without knowing what they were imitating. Some prayed for victory. Most prayed for peace. In towns like Albany, Savannah, and Wilmington, the lines were blurry. A loyalist could live next to a patriot. They might trade goods, help repair fences, share meals. And yet, at night, distrust lingered like smoke in the rafters. Tensions ran high. There were tarring and featherings. Homes burned in the night. Accusations whispered in courtrooms. Sometimes, men returned from war to find their land confiscated, taken, because someone accused them of loyalty to the king. Sometimes women were shamed for hosting British Officer 7 when it meant saving their families from ruin. The revolution, for many, was not black and white. It was gray and heavy. Take the story of Elizabeth Murray, a Boston widow and merchant. Before the war, she had built her own business, rare for a woman at the time. When the war came, she supported independence, yet she still had friends in England. She gave food to American soldiers, but also protected her British neighbors from angry mobs. To some, she was a hero. To others, a traitor. Mostly, she was tired. Or consider the Iroquois Confederacia, powerful alliance of Native American nations. They tried to remain neutral at first, but the war split even them. Some sided with the British, who had promised to protect their lands. Others sided with the Patriots, hoping for a better future. In the end, the war shattered their unity. They lost homes, people, sovereignty. They were never the same, and the enslaved people whose fate hung in limbo. Some fought for the British, enticed by promises of freedom. Some ran to join American lines, hoping the cause of liberty would include them. Many were betrayed. Some were freed, but all of them saw the war not as a story of flags, but as a gamble for dignity in a world that had denied them both humanity and hope. In churches, sermons divided congregations. One Sunday, a minister might preach loyalty to the king as Christian duty. The next, his replacement might call for revolution as God's justice. Pews emptied. Friendships broke. Faith was shaken, because when war enters the soul, even heaven seems to take sides. Through it all, acts of quiet resistance bloomed. A woman sewing a patriot's coat in secret. A loyalist father hiding his son's musket out of fear. A child delivering letters between generals never knowing the weight they carried. A merchant feeding both sides, hoping just to stay alive. In one small town in Connecticut, a boy named Silas scribbled in a journal, "Today, Mother cried again. She fears we shall lose the farm. Mr. Jones next door has joined the Redcoats. Father says we are no longer to speak to them, but I still do when no one is looking. Mrs. Jones gave me a biscuit. It was not treason, it was humanity, and war does not always know what to do with that." As the war dragged on, the divisions deepened. Loyalist families fled to Canada or back to England. Some never returned. Their homes were taken, their names erased, and yet others who stayed patriots and loyalists alike would later sit side by side when peace came. Because war may end with treaties, but healing comes from something slower. Forgiveness, memory, time. By 1780, the colonies were tired of fighting, of choosing sides, of burying neighbors. But the revolution continued not only in muskets and maps, but in every house where someone whispered, "What now?" To be continued in Part 10, Women, Slaves, and the Unspoken Revolution, where liberty was promised to some, but dreamed of by all. While the drums of war beat loud on battlefields, while generals wrote letters and congressmen signed declarations, a quieter revolution stirred in kitchens, in fields, in whispered prayers by candlelight. It was not recorded in official histories. It did not wear a uniform, and yet, without it, the American Revolution could never have survived. This was the unspoken revolution, fought not just by soldiers, but by women, by enslaved people, and by those the Declaration did not name but who felt its echoes in their bones. The women who held the nation's breath. When men went off to war, it was women who remained. They stayed behind not because they were afraid, but because someone had to keep the world turning. They planted crops. They tended livestock. They ran businesses, shops, post offices. They raised children in homes too quiet. They wrote letters that never received replies. They mourned without certainty. Was he gone or just missing? Take Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams. In the spring of 1776, while her husband was in Philadelphia helping shape a new nation, Abigail was at home in Massachusetts, raising their children, managing their farm, and thinking deeply. She wrote to him, "I desire you would remember the ladies, for if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion." It was not a joke. It was a warning. It was a vision, but that vision would take generations more to be heard. Some women, like Deborah Sampson, refused to wait. She disguised herself as a man, joined the Continental Army, and fought bravely under the name Robert Shirtliff. She slept in tents, marched through mud, tended to her own wounds so her identity would not be discovered. When her truth finally came out, she was not condemned. She was quietly honored. She had fought for a country that would not yet fight for her. Others, like Molly Pitcher, stepped onto the battlefield not in disguise, but in desperation. When her husband collapsed beside a cannon at the Battle of Monmouth, she took his place. Loaded, fired, reloaded, with the sun beating down and bullets flying. And still others stew many to name-kept homes running, children fed, towns alive. They did not march. They endured. They held the nation together while it tore itself apart. The enslaved who dreamed of freedom. The Declaration said, "All men are created equal." But on the very day it was signed, thousands of men, women, and children remained in bondage. They tilled the soil, cooked the meals, built the roads, fought the war often for both sides. And yet, they were not considered citizens, not considered fully human under the law. But that did not stop them from hearing the whispers of freedom. Some, like Peter Salem, were given a musket and joined the patriot cause. He fought at Bunker Hill, stood side by side with white soldiers, and fired a shot that may have changed the tide of the battle. Others, like Crispus Attucks, died even earlier, long before the Declaration, killed in the Boston Massacre of 1770, often remembered as the first casualty of the Revolution. An African American, a former slave, a man whose blood stained the streets before independence, had a name. Some enslaved people fled to the British, believing the promises made by officers like Lord Dunmore in Virginia, who offered freedom to any slave who would join the king's forces. Thousands accepted. They wore red, fought bravely, and many were betrayed, later returned to slavery or abandoned. Others found their own paths, through escape, through negotiation, through endurance. Some were emancipated after the war. Others were not. The contradiction was glaring. How could a country founded on liberty begin with so many in chains? The founders had no answer, so they postponed the question. But the enslaved did not. In cabins and quarters, songs were sung. Songs that carried double meanings. About rivers, about freedom, about hope. And with each note, a revolution was kept alive, not political, but spiritual. The belief that someday, freedom would mean everyone. The people history forgot. The revolution was also carried by artisans and orphans, dockhands, apprentices, and those who had no property and no vote. They fought in militias, delivered messages through the night, carried powder, cleaned rifles, built the forts. No statues bear their names. But without them, the revolution would have had no arms, no legs, no hands. And the Native American nation, some who fought alongside the patriots, others with the British, watched as both sides spoke of liberty while taking their land. To them, this war was not a revolution. It was a continuation of displacement, of treaties broken, of futures stolen. The irony of the revolution was that those who were excluded from its promise were often the ones who carried its weight. Women, slaves, the voiceless, the forgotten. They did not appear on the scrolls of Congress. They did not draft constitutions, but they dreamed, they sacrificed, and they waited for a country that would take longer to come than anyone had promised. By 1781, the war was nearing its end. But the other revolutions, the ones in kitchens, in fields, in hearts, were just beginning, because liberty, once imagined, does not return to sleep. To be continued in Part 11, Crossing the Delaware. A Christmas like no other, where cold winds carried the weight of a nation's last hope. It was Christmas night, 1776, and it did not feel like a season of cheer. There were no candles in windows, no feasts on tables, No songs in the streets. In the camps along the banks of the Delaware River, there was only wind, cold, sharp, and relentless. It sliced through tents and uniforms. It froze fingers and faith alike. The men of Washington's army sat quietly. Their coats were thin. Their boots, if they had any, were cracked and soaked. Some wrapped rags around their feet. Some had no rations left. Many had not been paid in weeks. They were hungry, sick, and tired. Tired of marching, of waiting, of losing. Since the defeat in New York and the retreat across New Jersey, the army had dwindled. Some deserted. Some died. Some simply disappeared into the gray countryside. By now, less than 3,000 troops remained with General George Washington, and many of them had enlistments set to expire at the end of the year. In a few more days, the revolution might collapse, not by defeat, but by exhaustion. But Washington did not give up. He could not. He stood among his soldiers that night, not as a general above them, but as one of them, his cloak frozen stiff at the edges, his face pale with worry and resolve. He had one last plan, and it would be risky. Impossible, some said, but he believed it was necessary. The plan was this: cross the icy Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles in the dark, and surprise the Hessian forces stationed at Trenton, New Jersey the next morning. The Hessians, German mercenaries hired by the British, were known for their discipline and ruthlessness. But on Christmas, Washington gambled. They would be relaxed, unprepared, caught off guard. Still, it meant crossing a river in the middle of a snowstorm, in pitch black, with freezing wind, ice-choked currents, and sleet slashing sideways. Failure would mean disaster. Success might mean survival. The crossing began just after dark. Large Durham boats, flat-bottomed rivercraft, were pushed into the ice. The Marblehead men from Massachusetts, experienced sailors and fishermen, led the way. They rowed through ice floes, guiding the rest. Each man carried his musket, wrapped in cloth. Each step onto the boat was a risk. The ice slick, the water rising, the wind howled, the snow fell sideways. Visibility was almost zero. Horses slipped, cannons had to be ferried separately, then dragged up muddy hills. But still they moved. Washington stood tall on the riverbank, refusing to sit, refusing to rest. He helped men into boats. He gave quiet orders. He watched the river with eyes sharp from worry. By 3 a.m., all men had crossed. But the march was far from over. 9 miles lay between them and Trenton on roads now turned to slush. They marched, some barefoot, leaving red in the snow, some falling, only to be lifted again. They walked in silence, save for the wind and their own labored breath. As dawn broke, the snow turned to icy rain, and through the mist, the town of Trenton appeared dim and unaware. Washington gave the order, attack. His troops charged down 2 roads, surrounding the town. The Hessians were caught entirely off guard. Some still slept. Others tried to form ranks, but the chaos was too great. Gunfire echoed through the streets. Smoke curled between rooftops. Within 45 minutes, it was over. Nearly 1,000 Hessians surrendered. Only a handful of American troops were wounded. It was a complete victory, but more than a military win, it was a psychological one. For months, the revolution had been on its knees. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, hope returned. News spread quickly. Across the colonies, men who had doubted began to believe again. Enlistments rose. Support grew. Even British commanders were stunned. The Americans had not just survived the winter. They had struck, and they had struck well. Washington, never one to boast, remained somber. He knew how fragile it all still was. But in his eyes, the flame that had nearly gone out was flickering again. He did not rest long. Within days, he launched another bold attack at Princeton. Another surprise, another victory. And suddenly, the British campaign in New Jersey began to unravel. The revolution had been saved not by numbers, not by firepower, but by grit. by men who marched barefoot through snow, by sailors who rode through ice in the dark, by a commander who refused to give in to despair. It had been saved on Christmas, not with celebration, but with courage and silence. Years later, many would remember the painting. Washington standing in the boat, ice all around, flag waving in the wind. But few would remember the aching joints, the soaked socks, the fear of slipping, the weight of frostbitten hands clutching frozen rope. That was the real crossing. And in that cold, in that night, a nation learned how to fight not just to win, but to endure, where the revolution froze, but did not fracture. When winter fell upon Valley Forge in December of 1777, it did not fall gently. It came with teeth, with howling winds that pierced tents and cracked the earth, with frost that bit into bone, with hunger that hollowed cheeks and hope alike. Washington's army, what remained of it, arrived there not as victors, but as survivors. After defeats in Philadelphia and Brandywine, after months of marching, retreating, and bleeding, they needed a place to rest, to regroup, to breathe. Valley Forge was not a fortress. It was not a city. It was a stretch of Pennsylvania land marked by hills and woods, chosen for its defensive position close enough to monitor British forces in Philadelphia, yet far enough to avoid surprise attack. But it offered no shelter. When the first troops arrived, there were no cabins, no roads, no food, just frozen ground and the endless gray of winter skies. By January, nearly 12,000 men had gathered there, and what met them was not just cold but chaos. They built huts from logs and mud, hands numb with frostbite. They dug latrines, hauled water, foraged for firewood. Some wore only thin linen shirts. Some had no shoes. Footprints left bloody trails in the snow. And food? There was little. Horses starved and died. So did men. Some boiled bark into broth. Others ate their belts, their leather scabbards, anything to quiet the ache. At times, entire days passed with no rations distributed. One soldier wrote bitterly in a letter home, "We live without bread. We live without meat. We live without shoes. But we do not yet live without hope." That was the war. Distilled, disease stalked the camp. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox. Tents became sick rooms. Huts became tombs. Men died in silence, buried hastily, grieved by comrades too tired to cry. But even through this, the darkest winter of the Warth Army did not dissolve. And the reason, above all else, was George Washington. He walked among his soldiers daily. He visited the sick, spoke with officers, listened to complaints, wrote endless letters to Congress, begging for supplies. He made no grand speeches. He offered no false promises, but his presence, calm and unwavering, became a kind of fire in itself, something men gathered around when everything else grew cold. Then, in the heart of this suffering, came a surprise. A man arrived. He spoke little English, wore a strange uniform, carried himself with the bearing of a noble. His name was Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a former officer of the Prussian army, sent by Benjamin Franklin, vouched for by intrigue and diplomacy. Von Steuben had come not to fight, but to teach. And what he brought to Valley Forge was not food or medicine, but discipline. He began with drills. At first, the soldiers resisted. Why march in formation when your belly is empty? Why polish a musket when your friend just died of fever? But von Steuben persisted. He taught them how to move as one, how to fire, reload, and fire again. How to fight not just with passion, but with precision. And something began to change. Tired men stood straighter. They moved in rhythm. They learned how to hold a lineant, how to believe in one another. He joked with them, cursed in French, German, and broken English, laughed with officers, ate with privates. He respected them, and they in turn began to respect themselves again. What Valley Forge took in flesh, it gave back in spirit. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a new army was forming not on the battlefield, but in the ledgers and lobbies of Philadelphia. Men like Nathaniel Greene and Robert Morris worked tirelessly to improve the supply system, to deliver coats, blankets, barrels of salt pork. Bit by bit, things improved. The cabins stood tighter. The stores began to fill. Letters from home brought warmth. Prayer services offered solace. Even Martha Washington, George's wife, arrived to care for the sick, knitting, cooking, writing letters for the dying. By spring of 1778, the snow began to melt. The rivers cracked free of ice. The trees budded, and so too did the army. They emerged, not broken, but reforged. Still thin, still outgunned, but now they moved with unity, with knowledge, with fire. They were no longer a band of militias. They were an army, one that could stand toe-to-toe with the British. And across the ocean, another miracle unfolded. France declared support for the colonies. What began as an isolated rebellion was becoming a global war. The revolution had not only survived Valley Forge, it had been reborn there. In later years, many would speak of the cold, of the hunger, of the snow and the sickness, but others would remember something else: the songs sung by the fire, the drills at dawn, the letter from a mother tucked into a coat pocket, the officer helping his men build a chimney with his own hands. Valley Forge was where the army froze, but it was also where it learned to believe in itself. And belief, once kindled, is not so easily extinguished. Where a lonely revolution became an international flame. For years, the American colonies had fought alone. They had stood against an empire with no navy of their own, few trained soldiers, and a treasury held together by promises. They had bled in forests, across frozen rivers, in farm fields. They had lost cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They had marched barefoot, starved in huts, buried brothers in shallow graves. And through it all, the rest of the world had watched from afar, cautious, curious, silent, but not forever. In the salons of Paris, beneath the glow of chandeliers and the murmur of violins, the American experiment had become a subject of obsession. Philosophers discussed the Declaration of Independence like scripture. Poets wrote odes to liberty. Nobles debated revolution between courses of duck and Bordeaux. To the French, America was not just a rebellion. It was a mirror showing them a version of freedom they longed for, but had not yet dared to chase. Still, France hesitated. They had their own scars, their own debts, their own fear of angering Britain too soon. But all that began to change with a single word from across the ocean: Saratoga, a turning point named Saratoga. In October 1777, General Horatio Gates, with support from a fierce and brilliant Benedict Arnold, delivered a crushing blow to British forces in upstate New York. The Battle of Saratoga was not just a military victory, it was proof. Proof that the Americans could defeat a full British army in open battle. Proof that the rebellion was not a dying flame, but a fire that could burn brighter. When news of the victory reached King Louis XVI, it was the moment many in his court had waited for. It was time to choose sides. The man who lit the diplomatic spark, already in France, was a man with spectacles, gray hair, and a reputation that stretched across continents. Benjamin Franklin. He was no soldier, no noble, but he was the perfect ambassador. With wit as sharp as his mind, Franklin charmed the French. He wore a simple fur hat, dressed plainly, and quoted Voltaire and Rousseau with ease. Parisians adored him. Women flirted with him. Philosophers toasted him. And behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly securing loans, arranging meetings, nudging the French closer and closer to alliance. And in February 1778, he succeeded. The Treaty of Alliance. On a cold day in Paris, France officially recognized the United States of America. They signed a treaty of friendship and mutual defense. They promised ships, guns, soldiers, money. The lonely revolution had become a world war. A young nobleman with fire in his eyes. Among those who had joined even before the treaty was signed was a young man of wealth and title, barely 20 years old, Marquis de Lafayette. He had defied orders, left his family, and crossed the ocean to fight for liberty not his own. Washington grew to love him like a son. The troops admired his courage, his charm, his humility. Lafayette bled with them, slept beside them, marched through mud and smoke with them. He became a bridge between two revolutions, yet to fully awaken. The British reaction. When Britain learned of the Franco-American alliance, it was more than a diplomatic loss. It was a nightmare. Now, British ships had to fight on two oceans. Their supply lines were threatened. Their fear of a wider European war became reality. Soon, Spain would join the war as well, though not formally allied with the US. They declared war on Britain. Even the Dutch Republic would be drawn in. The British Empire, once so confident, now found itself surrounded. What France brought, French aid came in waves. Guns and powder, filling American stores. Gold, keeping soldiers paid and Congress afloat. Generals, offering new strategies and discipline. And finally ships. By 1780, a French fleet had landed in Rhode Island. Troops in shining uniforms marched alongside Americans in patched-up coats. Orders were shouted in two languages. Campfires burned with new food, new stories, new songs. It wasn't always smooth. There were cultural clashes, distrust, pride, but they shared a common enemy, and that was enough. A global conflict. Suddenly, the war stretched far beyond the colonies. In the Caribbean, battles raged for control of Sugar Islands. In India, British and French forces clashed. At Gibraltar, the Spanish and French laid siege to the British stronghold. What began as a rebellion in 13 ragged colonies was now a continental struggle. The psychological shift. For Washington's men, news of the French alliance was like a gust of wind to a dying flame. It meant they were no longer alone. It meant their struggle had meaning beyond their own soil, that the world had seen the man chosen to stand beside them. The dream of liberty, once fragile and faint, now had voices echoing in Paris, Madrid, Amsterdam. And for the British, it meant that time was no longer on their side. The revolution had entered a new phase. More armies, more ships, more fire, but perhaps more importantly, more belief. Where the cannons faded, and a nation took its first quiet breath. By the autumn of 1781, the American Revolution had dragged on for 6 long, bitter years. 6 years of marching and bleeding, 6 years of promises and doubt, 6 years of a fledgling nation teetering between hope and collapse. But in a quiet town along the York River in Virginia, the war's great turning point was about to arrive, not with a scream, but with a silence. The trap is set. British General Charles Cornwallis, weary of fighting in the Carolinas, had moved his army north and established a base at Yorktown. He believed it was safe. The town was fortified. He had supply lines from the sea, and he expected reinforcements from New York. But what Cornwallis didn't know was that a massive plan was unfolding around him. General George Washington, now seasoned with loss and strategy, had decided to strike, but he wouldn't do it alone. He had French troops at his side by General Rochambeau, and most importantly, he had a French fleet moving toward the Chesapeake Bay. It was a rare opportunity. If the Americans and French could trap Cornwallis by land, and the French Navy could block him by sea, the war's fate might change in a single blow. The march to Virginia. Washington led his army south from New York hundreds of miles on foot through rain and heat and dust. Soldiers whispered of hope, of home, of finality. Civilians cheered as they passed. Children waved. Old men stood with hands over hearts. They were not just marching to battle. They were marching to closure. The siege begins. By late September, the trap had closed. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had arrived and defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off escape by sea. Washington and Rochambeau's forces encircled Yorktown. American and French flags flew side by side across the fields. Tents stretched like seas of canvas. Over 17,000 Allied troops faced off against 8,000 British soldiers, and so began the siege of Yorktown. It wasn't a grand battle. It was a slow tightening of the noose. Day by day, the Allies dug trenches, moved artillery into place, bombarded British positions. The sky thundered with cannon fire. The ground trembled. Smoke hung in the air for weeks. Cornwallis waited, but no help came. No ships, no reinforcements. Only hunger, only fear. The night assault. On the 14th of October, American and French forces launched a daring night attack on key British redoubts' fortified outposts. Leading one of the charges was Alexander Hamilton, then a young officer desperate to prove himself. The assault was swift, furious, and successful. The British line crumbled. Cornwallis could see the end coming. The surrender. On the 17th of October, a white flag appeared over the British trenches. Cornwallis requested terms. 2 days later, on the 19th of October, 1,781 British troops marched out of Yorktown in silence. Their flags furled, their drums muffled, their muskets stacked in surrender. Cornwallis himself claimed to be ill and sent his second-in-command to offer the sword. Washington, ever the gentleman, refused to accept it directly. He passed the duty to General Benjamin Lincoln, who, a year earlier, had been forced to surrender to the British at Charleston. Now, the tables had turned. The moment. For the soldiers who had suffered through the snows of Valley Forge, for the farmers who had left behind plows for powder, for the families who had watched sons march off and never return, Yorktown was not a celebration. It was relief. A weight lifted, a breath released. Some men wept quietly. Others stood in stunned silence. Many simply sat down on the earth and did nothing at all, letting the stillness wash over them. They had made it. The war was not over, but it was ending. Technically, the war would continue for another 2 years. Skirmishes would break out. Diplomats would argue in Europe. British troops would remain in cities like New York. But Yorktown was the turning point the world could not ignore. In London, news of the defeat shocked Parliament. Support for the war collapsed. King George III still hoped for control, but the tide had turned too far. Peace negotiations began. The silence after. After Yorktown, Washington did not disband his army. He remained vigilant. He knew the fight was not just on battlefields, but in the very idea of what this new country would become. He rode through the camps, spoke with soldiers, wrote letters. He waited, and the people, those who had waited, suffered, hoped, began to do something revolutionary in its own quiet way. They imagined a country with its own laws, its own voice, its own future. For some, it meant dreams fulfilled. For others, women, enslaved people, native nations, it meant waiting longer. But the possibility had been born, and from that, everything would grow. Yorktown was not a finish line. It was a pause, a soft space between the violence of revolution and the uncertainty of nationhood. But in that silence, in that slow sunrise over the fields of Virginia, America exhaled for the first time as something whole, where the war ended, but the story had just begun. In the spring of 1783, a quiet descended over the former colonies. There were no drums, no gunfire, no marching columns or smoking battlefields, just the long, unfamiliar sound of peace. The Treaty of Paris had been signed in September of the previous year. Britain formally recognized the United States of America. Borders were drawn. Ships turned for home. After 8 years of war, it was over. And yet, for many, that first breath of freedom felt more like a question than a celebration. What did freedom mean? For the soldiers who had fought and bled, freedom meant home. It meant taking off the uniform, if they still had one. It meant returning to farms overgrown with weeds, to children who no longer recognized their faces, to debts unpaid and promises unfulfilled. Congress, nearly bankrupt, could not pay them all. Many went uncompensated, their pensions delayed for years. Some wandered, some petitioned, Some gave up, and yet they were called heroes. The war had made them free men, at least on paper. For George Washington, freedom meant something else. It meant walking away from power. In December of 1783, Washington resigned his commission before Congress. He bowed, he thanked them, and he left, returning to Mount Vernon, to his farm, to a quieter life. The world gasped. A man with that much influence, that much adoration stepping down? Kings did not do that. Conquerors did not do that. But Washington did, and in doing so, he gave birth to a new kind of leader, one who saw duty not as a throne, but as a burden to be relinquished when finished. For Congress, freedom meant responsibility. They now had a country to govern, 13 states each with its own laws, loyalties, and fears. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the war, proved weak. There was no strong central government, no president, no ability to tax. It was like a wagon with too many reins and no one holding them. And yet, in this mess of uncertainty, something remarkable began to form: a new constitution. In 1787, delegates gathered again in Philadelphia. Many were veterans of the Revolution. They argued, drafted, revised. They asked the same question over and over: what kind of country do we want to be? From those arguments came the bones of what would become the United States Constitution, an imperfect, ambitious framework for something never tried before, a republic of the people, for the people, at least in theory, because for many, freedom still stood just out of reach. For women, they had run farms, mended wounds, delivered supplies, raised children while their husbands fought. Some had disguised themselves and marched into battle. Others had written letters, inspired essays, challenged the very notion of passive citizenship. But when the war ended, most women were expected to return to silence. They could not vote. They could not hold office. They were told to celebrate liberty while remaining excluded from it. Still, they remembered, and in time, they would rise. For enslaved people, the Declaration had said, all men are created equal. But in 1783, over 400,000 human beings remained enslaved in the new nation. Some states, like Massachusetts and Vermont, abolished slavery. Others dug in deeper. Many enslaved people had fought in the warsome for the British, others for the Americans, lured by promises of freedom that often went unkept. Their revolution had not yet begun, but their voices, their stories, their resistance would echo long after muskets had gone silent. And eventually, that unfinished fight would return to the heart of America's conscience. For Native nations, the revolution, for them, was devastation. Many had allied with the British, believing the crown would protect their lands from expansion. When Britain surrendered, it handed over vast territories without consulting the tribes who lived there. Treaties were broken, borders were pushed west, and a new government, born of rebellion, became another colonizer. For Native peoples, the war did not bring freedom. It brought more loss. For Loyalists, tens of thousands of those who had sided with Britain fled. They were doctors, teachers, merchants, mothers. They left behind homes, shops, graves. Many went to Canada, some to England. Some stayed and tried to rebuild quietly, their allegiance a shameful memory. They had chosen the losing side, but they too had once believed they were fighting for order, for safety, for principle. History forgot many of their names, but their silence speaks volumes. And for the world, the American Revolution sent ripples across the globe. In France, it inspired a revolution of their own known that would rise in 1789 and consume kings. In Haiti, enslaved people would soon rise and form the first Black Republic. In South America, leaders like Bolivar would echo Jefferson's words decades later. America had not created liberty, but it had declared it loudly, and the world was listening. The new idea of America, what emerged after the war, was not a perfect nation, not a utopia, not a land of immediate equality. It was a beginning, a promise written not in granite but in ink that could fade, smudge, be rewritten. It would take generations to expand that promise, to live up to it, to question it. But the idea was there, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, that liberty belongs not to kings, but to people, that a country could be born not from bloodlines, but from belief. The muskets were silent, the banners were folded, the war was over, but the work, the slow, painful, magnificent work of building a nation had just begun, and it would never truly be finished, because liberty, once planted, must be tended forever.